Hey everybody, today we are going to talk about basic lighting setups using Autodesk Maya 2016. In this lesson we're going to cover essentially a basic lighting using the Maya software renderer, and then we're going to move on to the more advanced mental ray renderer in a little bit. So I went ahead and provided you guys with this start scene. Here we have this model of a treasure chest with a nice texture on it, and then this floor model that has a color bump or normal map and a specular map applied to it. So we'll get to how light affects those in a bit, but let's start with the good kind of texture setup. All right, so let's begin. To start, we're going to go ahead and work primarily in perspective mode, but let's set up a camera. So I'm going to go to Create, Cameras, Camera, and what that will do is actually the scene's quite big, so I'll scale it up. This will create a camera. And I want to set the camera here, so I'm going to do, with the camera selected, I'm going to do Panels, Look Through Selected, and that will allow me to fly inside of my camera. And what we can also do at this point is we can give it a nice little tilt. That looks about right. And I'm going to go ahead and put on my resolution gate. This resolution gate's really nice because it allows me to really center my object and allows me to deal with any negative space on the outside. So we'll kind of scale the plane just slightly and play a little bit with this. And that looks pretty good for now. Now, at any point, if I want to go back to my perspective, I can go Panel, Perspective, and then Perspective Camera. So that camera's up there, ready to go. If we really want, we can actually grab all of its attributes in the channel box, right-click while the camera's selected and say Lock. This way, there's no way we can change it by accident. We can go back to the Panels, Perspective, and then Camera 1, and then that will take us to our camera to render. But let's go ahead and stay in the perspective mode for now. We'll come back to that camera in a bit. And let's talk about some lighting. Now, before we really talk about lighting, we need to know that shaders and the renderer for the shaders have a huge effect on how our items are going to look in this scene. So by default, if I go up here to the top to render current frame, my scene's going to render and it's going to look pretty flat. But you'll notice there's some illumination, but there's really no proper lighting. In other words, there's no shadows and there's no highlights, and it's overall just kind of blown out. It also has rendered in the Maya software renderer, and you can see that in the few places where I'm rolling my mouse over. And the Maya software renderer, it's a really nice renderer, but it doesn't really give us realistic results. So we'll talk about that in a bit, and we'll switch out our renderer as we go forward. Now, when we're rendering lighting in Maya, we have to realize this is not the same lighting that is found in a real-time system. So Unity engine, Unreal game engine, other Dota game engines, none of those are going to be the exact same look as you get in Maya. So Maya is more intended for still renders or image sequences as we go. So let's go ahead and start by how I light. What I typically do is I go to my render settings, which is just this little cog in the render symbol, and I'm going to expand this just a little so you can see. I'm going to go down to render options, and I'm going to uncheck default lighting. So now when I hit render, if we've done it right, we really shouldn't get too much. Now we get a little bit of specularity on the plane, but overall it's not really affecting our item too much. And that specularity is actually an ambient. You can see in the shader here, I've accidentally put that ambient color. So if I tone that down, now we get nothing. Now there are objects there, they're just no light to light them. So let's go ahead and start throwing in lights. If we go to create, we're going to go ahead and start with a directional light. Let's go ahead and get a nice strong light source. So when we create that directional light, I'm going to hit scale and then move tool, and then I'll hit my kind of rotate tools, and I'm going to scale this into place. And what we can really do is let's put this on the other side of the camera. So let's rotate it Let's point this down. And if you have trouble pointing it, you can also hit the T key. The T key it's actually a really cool little trick. It will pull out these secondary handles, and you can even hold down the snap key, which is V, and it will snap to specific items in your scene. So that's pretty nice. Let's get a little more height on it. And let's go back and look through our camera. Go to camera 1. Now, we don't see much happening. How do we see what's going on with this light? Well, if we hit 7 on our keyboard, we'll actually be able to get a view of that light now. So if I go back to camera 1, you can see that it looks pretty decent. And I can kind of move that light where I see fit. But remember, we are trying to plan to render to camera 1. So we're going to want to keep going back and checking that. Our directional light is a lot like the sun in real life. It goes on and on. It has shadows, but it doesn't really have any decay. So if I render this now, you can see that I have light. I have some of my normal map kind of starting to pop into place on the floor, but I don't really have any cast shadows yet. So if I open up my cast shadows, in Maya, using Software Renderer, I have 2 options of shadows. I have depth map shadow attributes and ray trace shadow attributes. Now you'll notice ray trace shadow attributes are actually turned on, but we didn't see any shadows. Now the difference between ray trace and depth map, ray trace really use scene scale and they use 3D space to calculate their shadows, where depth map are almost a fake shadow. So Maya kind of calculates it using resolution and pixels. You can only use one or another on a light. Now you have every right to not use any shadows on a light if you choose fit. Now by default, if I use DMAP shadows, without changing much, you'll see now I have a strong cast shadow. That's really nice. But I can also lower the resolution to one of my powers of 2. For instance, if I type 128 and I hit render, you'll see now this shadow is very pixely. Let's go further. Let's do 64, like Nintendo 64. Hit render, and you can see it's even more pixelated. And I can actually adjust the filter size to maybe 5, and filter is like blur. You can see 5 was a little too much. It blurred a little too much of the shadow. Here we go. So I can start adjusting these categories to get a good result. Now, overall, it's okay. It's kind of heavy. It kind of doesn't decay. It's not the best looking shadow, but it does give me a nice looking highlight. So we'll come back to that. For this light, I'm going to go ahead and keep the shadows turned off for DMAP. Now, if I turn on ray trace shadows, remember in DMAP we had resolution and filter. In ray trace shadow attributes, we have light angle and shadow rays. Now, no matter what you do, they will not work. You actually have to go into your render settings in Maya Software and click on the Maya Software tab, and there's a little function called ray trace. Now, ray trace is a type of rendering mechanic that not only will give us shadows, but it will also start dealing with reflection and refraction. So when we actually turn it on in our render settings, it will know to activate it in the light, and we'll get not only reflections, you can see now this material needs adjusted, but we'll actually get shadows as well. So rather than continuing to re-render, I'm going to go ahead and drag a square over the area I want to render. And I'll go ahead and add maybe 3 and hit the blue box render region area. And you can see the light angle kind of disperses the shadow. It kind of gives it like a spray paint edge. And shadow rays, let's put that to 5, actually starts to blur those and smooth those in. So a combination of all of these methods will eventually get you a good result. So let's go ahead and do 15. Let's see. We're starting to get there. Maybe let's lower this down to 2. Well, that's not going to be enough. Maybe 4. So we can start getting a decent shadow. Now, you will notice as well when we deal with shadows in Maya that they're one black blob. Now, real shadows don't really do that. So this is where shadow color comes into play. If I simply take down my shadow color, what you'll notice is it's actually slightly more realistic, so it's not as heavy, but I also don't want to take my shadows to white because then they go away. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to click the input, the texture input node next to it, kind of like we were putting a file in, and I'm going to add a ramp. And on this ramp, I'm going to go from black to white. And I'm moving these little dots at the top, and I'm going to select smooth. All right, and I'm going to go back to our light. So now we have an input, and let's see what this input gives us. So let's do render region again. Now what you can see is it's a little harsh, but our shadow is starting to go away. It's starting to dissipate. We have a couple errors here and there. So we'll go back and let's change this color to a gray. And we'll keep adjusting. There we go. Maybe make it a little darker. Again, we're just looking for a little bit of subtlety here in our shadow. And we're starting to get there, maybe a little too dark. Let's go back. And it's really trial and error when you start lighting. So now we're getting that kind of cool look that we're going for. So now we can go and continue to adjust the shadow rays, whether we lower them or raise them, to kind of get that final look that we're going for. So I'm not really fond of having a shadow on this particular light because I want this light to act as that highlight. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the shadows, and I right-click Broke Connection for the shadow attribute. And all I want for this light is it to give me this nice highlight. And now that we have the reflections turned on, we can go into the blend shader. We can actually turn down the reflectivity and play with the specularity a little bit on the treasure chest. Let's re-render that. Now you can see it's not so mirror-like. With that said, we can adjust the reflectivity of the floor. Maybe we can get a little bit more reflectivity going on there. And we can kind of start playing with that. Now that all is dependent on our specular map, which actually is not really black and white, so we're going to get some more interesting results there. All right, so let's add another light. So this light is casting a highlight. Let's go ahead and add another light that will do our shadows. So I'm going to go ahead and add a point light. A point light is kind of like a light bulb, and I'm going to raise this point light and kind of put it where I see fit. Remember, we are going to eventually light off that camera. And point lights are a bit different, like the sunshine of directional lights. They're more like light bulbs. So we can actually put up decay in our light to kind of have a little bit more natural fall off. The lower you go on the decay list, the higher you're going to need. You can see I may even need up to 10,000 or more units to get this light to show. So here I have it set to 100,000 units. This is even 1,000,000 units, but if I go down to linear, it blows the scene out. So decay is really up to you as the user, but we're going to go ahead and use linear decay, and let's put in a value of 100. Let's go ahead and turn on our shadows. We'll keep it default and hit render. And we'll start, we can see we're getting some shadows cast. Maybe we want to move the light just slightly. There we go. Starting to get those downcast. We can see some shadows here. And we're going to fix this bright floor in a second here, but overall, that's pretty good. So this is kind of our highlight. This is kind of our shadow light or our key light if we're dealing with 3-point lighting. So we have highlights, we have shadows. Now let's get an overall fill light, and we could use different lights such as even area lights, spotlights. We can use an ambient light. So if I pull this ambient light and I just tone it down just ever so slightly, let's see what we get now. Starting to get that shape going, but this darn directional light is still blowing out our floor surface. So what if there is a way that I could tell this directional light to only affect the treasure chest and not to affect the ground. Well, that's called light linking. So if I go to my Windows relationship editors and I go down to the word light linking, I can actually go to light centric. So under Windows relationship editors light linking, light centric, I can open up this file, choose the light, and see whatever it highlights is what that light affects. So I do not want it to affect that polyplane 1. So I'm going to turn that off. By doing so, if I hit a quick re-render, it gives me a little more of a darker shadow. So now those other lights are affecting the floor, but only that highlight is affecting the back of my treasure chest. So that means what we really can do is we can crank this up. We can kind of tint. Let's go ahead and add maybe a green tint because we have some bluish greens in the scene. And now only that object has that tint to it. So it's a really nice kind of tool, and we're actually going to add some of this light here. So again, a really nice little tool to kind of simulate lighting. So now I'm going to sample that. I'm going to hit the done key, and I'm going to play with the other lighting effects, such as the light here. So we're going to put this super down. We're going to turn and play with the shade. And we're going to start turning down these areas. So what we can do is really get some nice effects going. So we still have a harsh shadow, but we can change that by continuing to play with our lights. Now, let's turn down the intensity a little bit more here. And let's see what we get. Now we're starting to get some more dramatic lighting. So that's pretty cool. So let's go ahead and go to our render camera. So perspective camera 1. And let's see what the render looks like from up here. It looks a lot nicer. Now we're getting nice cast shadows, our materials coming through. We even have a little bit of reflection right here in the floor. Let's go ahead and play with that shadow a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my key light, or what we call a point light. Now if you're locked in a camera and you can't find your light, you can always go into the focus attribute, and sometimes they'll just pop up. So here's my point light, and there it is. So I can kind of do that a little bit. And we'll go ahead and we'll start adjusting. Maybe we'll put 5 to start. Hit our render region. And to me, this is more trial and error. Here, 5 and 5 work really nicely. I'm getting that nice look. I can go ahead and attempt to add that ramp. So if I add a ramp and I add a couple of these attributes like we did in the first time. There we go. Just make sure we hit done. Let's test these out. We can start to get some really cool results. So again, we're mimicking natural light, and we're using Maya software renderer here now, which again, Maya software is not the most realistic of renderers. Okay? So what you'll really have to do, and you can even add other elements just to get a little bit darker. Here we go. And we'll hit a full render. You know, what we really want to do is see where we can push this even further. So let's go ahead and let's change the renderer. So if I go up to render using, I see I have a whole slew of renderers. Now, if you're using 2016, you may or may not have the option for mental ray. Now, if you went ahead and followed the directions in the beginning of class, if you Google Maya Mental Ray 2016, you can actually download this for free. But at first, it will not show up on this list. So if I go ahead and I go to my Windows Settings and Preferences plugin manager, I can actually turn on the Mental Ray plugin after I download it. And after it's all installed, it will say Maya to Mental Ray. Yours may look a little different, but it should say Maya to ML or MR. And I'm going to hit load and close. And now when I go here, Mental Ray shows up. Now Mental Ray is a ray trace renderer. In other words, I don't need to turn on ray trace. It just will work. So if I hit render, it's going to take a little bit longer, but look at the difference in quality that this has given me. It's much more rich in color, and it has a lot more color depth within the scene. So pretty amazing kind of upgrade from software. So let's go ahead and keep this render just so I can show you the difference. So I'll go ahead and keep image. I'm going to switch to software, do a quick render. And we'll keep this image, and then we can go back and forth. So you can see the depth that the Mental Ray renderer gives us. Now, unfortunately, Mental Ray is not loaded into Maya 2017. Instead, they traded it out for a render called Arnold. And you're more than welcome to try Arnold. The lighting is very similar, and you'll get very similar results, but it's going to be a slight different result than the Mental Ray renderer. So we're going to go ahead and stick to Mental Ray right now in Maya 2016. And let's go ahead and do some extra work. Now, if I go to back to my perspective view, I like this is my fill light, that ambient light I put in. I like that, but I'm not totally sold on it. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that. What Mental Ray gives me the ability to do is use an environment to conduct that fill area. So it kind of fills the scene with light. So to do that, I'm going to go into my Mental Ray settings. I want to double check that I have my default light enabled or turned off, pardon me. I want to go to quality, and real quick I'm going to go up to presets, load preset, production. That just will help overall quality go up. I'm going to take my indirect diffuse GI mode under the quality settings, and I'm going to go to final gather. What final gather is going to do is I'm going to create an atmosphere that the color of that atmosphere will bleed and essentially light our scene. So now I'm going to go to the Scene tab, and I'm going to click Image-Based Lighting, and I'm going to hit Create. And at this point I can hit Close, because what I have is this new attribute window, and what really has happened is I have this giant dome around my scene. So what we can do now is we have the ability to put in an image, which we'll address in a few seconds, or we can put from type, from image file to texture, and I can go ahead and use a default background. Maybe we'll put in kind of a soft blue, and we have that there. We can even have that emit light. Let's go back to our camera, and let's render this now. Now this final gather setting we turn on actually will act as that fill light, and it's taking this color and emitting it and adding it to our scene, which is pretty darn impressive. Give it a few seconds. You can see it does take quite a lot longer to kind of output, but the results are actually really, really nice. So overall, a really decent result. Now, if I mentioned if we wanted to, we can put an image. So if I search on the internet, let me open up my internet here, for HDR Image, high dynamic range imagery, I can find free HDR maps at a few of these websites. I like this SIBL archive. So I'm going to go ahead and open this, and it's going to load some scenes. And we're going to pick kind of maybe a medieval-esque environment. We'll see if we can find one. So somewhere this kind of sci-fi element would be. So I'm going through. And again, you don't have to be so picky. All of these are going to work differently. I'm going to pick this old industrial hall. We'll save it. Give it a few seconds to download. And let's open it up. And let's unzip it. There we go. I'll go ahead and include one of these on your project file so you don't have to go hunt for it. And let's use one of these in our scene. So let's go back to our scene and switch it back to image file and click the folder, go to our desktop and find that old industrial hall. And we can use an HDR, we can use the JPEG, or we can use the EXR. It's up to you. I'm going to use the HDR, or high dynamic range image. And when I put that in, what will happen is it's going to allow me, if I look at my perspective view, it's going to actually load this image in. Now, the one I picked is kind of blurry, it looks like. So let me pick one that you guys can see. There you go. So you can see it actually in the scene. The one that they had was blurry, so people maybe didn't want to see like the industrial background. So let's go to panels, perspective, camera, And let's see what this does now when we render this in Mental Ray. It takes the ambient color from that image, and it's going to take a little longer to render, but what's happening in the background is it's taking the imagery from the picture and it will use it in the lighting, it will use it to produce color, and it will also actually show up in the reflections as well, and it will give us a more realistic result. And so we're going to let this run through a little bit, and what it's doing again is calculating some imagery within the reflections, so it's going to give us automatically a nicer look, and it's using that final gather or that indirect light setting to really get what we want in the scene. So here you can see it's almost done. It's going through the final stages here, so it's rendering each pixel. And this varies depending on the speed of your computer. I have a very large scene, so my scene's going to take, just a little bit more time, but the results will be well worth it. Now, at any point, we should remember, before we hit render, and something I didn't do is save. So make sure you're saving your file frequently so you can get the best results in your scene. So it's almost done here. Here we go. We have this beautiful render that we have, a little bit of shadows, but it's not that dramatic, and so forth. So if we want to save this render, we would just, like any render, whether you use Mental Ray or Software Renderer, you would right-click or go up to Render View, Save Image, and here you can choose what image type. So we'll pick JPEG, and we'll just say Render. And we'll make sure we put this on the desktop. And one of the things I would like you guys to remember to do, if you keep it default to save raw image, your scene's going to look a lot darker than it looks in here. If you say saved color managed image, it will look a lot brighter. So if we hit save with color managed image on, that's a mouthful, we will now have, give it a second, we will now have this image. Pretty cool, huh? So we can get a rather quick, nice rendered result. So let's go ahead and trash that one and relook at our lighting. And now, if we want to maybe lower the dome intensity, we can highlight our dome, and we can actually go to render stats and adjust environment and adjust the final gather. So by turning these white layers down, we can actually lower the overall lighting in the scene. So if I do a quick render, you'll see automatically it's going to be a lot darker. So these settings in the dome under the render stats, color gain, and adjust final gather color effects will really adjust the overall darkness of your final scene, and that will allow the other lights to really shine through. So it's really a give or take. The other big thing while we wait for this to render that we want to make sure that we're realizing is materials and specularity and reflectivity play a huge role in your final render. So depending if you use a Blinn or a Lambert or even a specialty shader found in the Mental Ray default material nodes like an MIA material, it really will affect the final outcome of your scene. So just keep that in mind as you push forward and as you start your lighting setups. My biggest tips of advice are to make sure that you start from darkness, so that will help. So turn off that default lighting in your render settings, and that you just kind of build slowly. Think about lights and what each light does. Think about a primary light source, a light that casts solely shadows or a key light, and think about a fill light. In our case, we're using a final gather image-based lighting dome to get that final result. And by doing so, and by putting all these elements together, you can see now that we've darkened this dome, we're getting some really rich and contoured options within the actual area. Now, in a later lesson, we'll learn how to utilize lighting in game engines, because lighting in game engines are completely different for real time, mainly because we're rendering still pictures here. Where in a game engine, we constantly have to update our frames so you as the player can continue to play their game. And that's why you have a slight difference there overall. So we're about 60% here. At any point, if you wanted to cancel the render for whatever reason, you can go ahead and just hit the escape key. I suggest when Maya is rendering, do not go and maybe go on Facebook or go on another website. Just kind of let it run. If you have Norton like mine, it's very annoying. It will pop up and mess with you. So you want to kind of avoid those because those tend to freeze your scene. In my case, I got pretty lucky there. And right now what it's doing is doing one more pass, and you can see it's kind of smoothing these pixels. And this is going to be a couple minute render, but it's well worth the wait, because what's happening is we are getting some pretty beautiful results in shadow. We have a highlight, a little bit of a highlight. Probably could even afford to get it a little stronger. And then we have this overall fill light. And up at the top of the render settings, you have the ability to pump up the brightness or the exposure and play up and down with the contrast. But if you're happy with what you got and you do File, Save Image, and make sure you save Color Managed Image and type a name, you'll have a really beautiful piece. And, you know, it may take 2 minutes and 50 seconds, but it's a pretty powerful result. So I hope you guys learned the basics of lighting and the basics of kind of putting a light into a scene, testing it, using your hotkeys to turn on and off your light. And I can't wait to see what you guys produce. Thanks. Catch you next time.